think that mindset, that retribution mindset, has essentially pervaded our justice policy. We exported that to the US, and the US then, of course, went off and took it to even greater extremes. But I think, sadly, we've never learned the lesson that kind of punitive approach, whilst it might have had some value 1,000 years ago, you know, when life and societies were much simpler and you know, binary kind of decisions about good and evil and right and wrong were maybe helpful in certain contexts. You know, in a society like ours, a complex society with complex criminal issues, complex societal issues, sociological issues and economic issues, you simply can't punish your way out of a crime problem. So I think, you know, that's the answer to the question. I think we essentially have the Anglo-Saxon world, if you like, has adopted that mindset of punitive responses to every perceived wrong, and we've never really quite developed the mindset. I'm particularly impressed by the Norwegian commitment to what they call a reintegration guarantee, so that those who come out of custody are guaranteed access to housing and work and, you know, other support services. We don't do that, and by not doing that, people come out of prison, unsurprisingly, when they're unsupported and or homeless and or addicted and or suffering from other mental health issues. You know, they can't reintegrate into society, and many of them just end up on the revolving door or in the revolving door. And I mean, in a nutshell, I think that's the problem.
Absolutely. And of course, the Anglo-Saxon system of justice was in many ways one that we would find quite strange now, wasn't it? If you go back over a few thousand years, ideas of trial by cake and combat and fire, something that so certainly we wouldn't have today. David, the same question to you. How do you think the UK ended up with both a dysfunctional prison system and high reoffending rates?
Like Chris, I would say that for me, there are three aspects to the criminal justice system. First of all, prevention completely. How do we stop people getting into the system in the first place when they first come on the agenda? Secondly, how do we punish people, which is part of the prison system and justice system? But equally, how do we reform and rehabilitate and reintegrate people into society? And like Chris has said, I think we've not really focused on the first very much, which is prevention. We've focused an awful lot on punishment, and we haven't focused so much as we should be doing on reintegration, reform, and rehabilitation. And I think if we look at particularly over the last sort of time, I was a Justice Minister in 2007-2008. We put a white paper out at the time, which was headlined "Punishment and Reform." It was about how we reform the system to ensure that people feel that people who have offended still have to account for their offending behaviour, but at the same time we find a mechanism to ensure that those people most people come out of prison, most people come out within 12 months, most people come out within 2 or 3 years, that they are rehabilitated as far as we can when in. We tackle some of the root causes problems that have brought them to the system in the first place, and we reintegrate back into society. And I think what's happened is that sense of rehabilitation, reintegration and reform has been shouted down by the sound of punishment. And I think ultimately as well, Will, I think that we're jailing some people who shouldn't be jailed, people for short sentences who go through the system, 60% reoffending rate in the first year. We're jailing people who potentially have mental health challenges or medical challenges. And what we should be trying to do is to look at what makes society safer. What we want to do is to use the justice system, not just to punish, but also to make sure our society is safe and we reduce offending. And I think the balance is currently wrong. And, we can talk later about things that we've tried to do. And I'll just say, I know Chris will agree with this, it is complicated. It is not easy. It is going to come up against a whole raft of challenges. But ultimately, what the people I represented when I was a member of Parliament wanted is just to not have crime, to have a safer society. And there are ways in which we can do that, which includes prison, but which also maybe reforms and looks at the different ways in which prison operates.
Absolutely. And of course, Norway's approach to prisons has resulted in low reoffending rates and low crime rates. Why has the UK not moved towards this approach of reforming prisoners rather than focusing on punishment? Lauren, if you could give your response to this question.
So it's quite a multifaceted issue. I'd say probably, underlying it is, and this might surprise people, it's about the economic organisation of our countries being different. So there's quite a lot of research that's been done that says how you organise a country and its economy will influence sort of the cultural values that they share. So Norway is far more collectivist, and all the research shows us that, quite aggressively capitalist countries like the UK have more individualism and therefore less trust among their citizens. So, Norway puts a lot of emphasis on welfare, lots of universalism in their policy, and there's a far more caring approach to their governance. So as a result of that, there is a higher degree of trust, and the people there are just far less, I would say, vengeful when they look at prisoners. So the general understanding is that people need to be helped if they're going to reform themselves. And, trust in this country between the public and the government, thank you for, the Conservative Party of the last 18 months have completely torn that up, is going to make things very difficult for us if we want to reform prisons, because, it's not as simple as just creating better justice policy and assuming people will vote for it. If they don't trust the messenger, they're not going to trust sort of the message that's being pushed. And it is difficult, I can imagine, to be a politician in this country and want prison reform, because you've got the media working against you, essentially, because there's a lot of sensationalization, and anything remotely reform orientated gets called soft, in the tabloid press. So it's going to take politicians with a little bit more bravery and a little bit more legwork, really, to get this over the line and get it sorted. But progressives haven't been perfect on that either. Even under Jeremy Corbyn, probably one of the most liberal Labour leaders that we've had ever, maybe, our justice policy, our prison policy wasn't where it needed to be. So it's got a lot for everyone to do to counter this. And I think, progressives need to be the ones pushing it forward.
Absolutely. Chris, on the same question, why do you think the UK has not moved towards this approach of reforming prisoners rather than focusing on punishments? I mean, do you think that Lauren has something there when she mentions the degree to which perhaps the media have played a part in this?
Well, I think it's all politics, frankly. I mean, David's government did many good things, but one of them was not reducing the use of prison as a form of punishment. And the mere fact that David so frequently used the word punishment, and everybody almost takes it for granted that that's an ingredient of a functioning justice system, it tells you all you need to know. It's very difficult for any politician to whether someone who's already been elected or someone who is standing for election, to stand on a platform of reducing imprisonment, particularly for offences that people consider require very long sentences. And the truth of it is that the public have not been taken on that journey. They weren't taken on that journey by Tony Blair, and understandably so. I mean, the truth is that why did Tony Blair win election with such great success? It's because he was populist and popular. And populism and popular don't necessarily sit too well with a policy agenda which says we want to halve our prison population. Because most people say, well, no, we think sentences are too short. Well, the truth of it is that on average, sentences for most of the most serious crimes have doubled since I started in practice almost 30 years ago, including during the long period that David's party was in government. And right the way through that whole period, the prison population went up, the use of prison sentences and the length of prison sentences went up. And we now see a situation where we have well over 80,000 in prison as opposed to about 40,000 when I started out. And yes, there's been population growth, but nothing like that. And so, as I say, I think that the core problem is politics. It's the same in the US, where, I mean, I met, as part of my sort of research for the book, I met an elected appellate judge, criminal judge in Alabama. And he very frankly, in confidence, told me why all of the things that the system had was trying to do, like imprison people for very long periods, if not forever, and to imprison people even for sort of minor drug offences for 20 years and such like. He knew that and he was very clear. He said, this is nonsense. It makes the whole thing worse. So the obvious question is, well, why do you comply with that? Why don't you stand for election on a different platform? And he was very clear, because I'd never win and I wouldn't be a judge. So I can only be a judge. And I think the same applies to politicians in many regards, particularly those who have aspirations to be prime minister or cabinet ministers. You know, they very much have to kind of be seen to be tough on crime, in inverted commas. And if not, then the media, social media, and of course political opponents will take huge advantage of that perception of softness. So I'm not sure how you square the circle. I'm not sure there's an answer, because ultimately things only change from one direction or the other, don't they? They either change because of a public demand for something, which politicians respond to, or politicians putting forward a positive message that the public responds to, or both. And at the moment, I think a message that says, as I advocate, halve the use of prison, legalise and licence the supply of drugs, stop criminalising children as young as 10, which are bonkers when surely any rational person can see that that's not right. And anyone who's ever met or known a 10-year-old, but you advocate these policies and you just get shot down and you get accused of being soft. And it would take a very brave and very popular politician to be able to make any difference in this area, I think.
Mm-hmm. And of course, I mean, we've already sort of touched upon the distinctions between the very briefly the Norwegian prison system and the British prison system, the system in the UK. And I think, Lauren, in your response to the previous question, you touched upon part of why you think that there are those differences. But I mean, why do you think that Norway's prison system has had so much success in comparison to the UK?
So I think the ethos in Norway is generally that if you treat people with respect as humans in proper conditions, that's going to be far more conducive to their rehabilitation. And they take more of a long-term approach because they recognise that one day those prisoners will be released back into the community. So when they are, they will need help to adjust, but they also need help to desist from offending again. And I think the Norwegian public are generally more supportive of that in a way that the British people perhaps aren't. And obviously, you know, the British system is run in the short term, which is, let's face it, almost inevitable given the sort of way the Tories have managed prisons for the last 12 years. So it's very hard to plan for sort of the long term when you can only just about get by on a daily basis without some level of crisis. It is a crisis almost entirely of the Tories' own making, but it's still going to be difficult for anyone really to sort out. Like Rory Stewart, I feel like he kind of got the issues that were afoot, but there wasn't the will to change things in the Conservative Party, because on the face of it, a lot of Conservative justice policy relies on being visible and gimmicky, sort of like the Rwanda policy, or when Grayling tried to ban books in prisons. Like, there's little evidence that it's going to work, but they're very vocal about it because they're trying to appeal to their more reactionary populist voter base. Sort of how Chris was saying about, you know, the populism side of things. So yeah, I think the reason Norway has generally done better is just because the ethos is there from the start. Like, it's a more consistent approach. They offer educational activities, opportunities for jobs in prisons. It gets people used to life outside of the prison. It stops them becoming institutionalized. And, you know, they have the opportunity to learn new things and do things rather than just being warehoused like they are in the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. Chris, what are your thoughts on this? Why do you think that the Norwegian prison system has had so much success in comparison to the UK system?
Well, because it's evidence-based, and the Norwegian policy is based on pragmatism. That in some ways is the major difference between the way that British politics works and American politics works, because we are very similar in many respects, and we're sadly drifting more towards that American populist model. But that's the reality, is that Norwegian policy. I mean, Norwegian's a highly educated country on average, much more on average highly educated than the UK, and it's a country of much greater individual wealth on average than in the UK. So when you put those two things together, particularly with a sort of liberal ethos, if you like, that broadly lies behind Norwegian kind of public life and policy, you end up with very different outcomes. And I think the simple fact is that Norwegian politicians have been able to convince the voting public that a pragmatic approach to criminal justice reduces crime, and ultimately, as David said, that's what everybody should want. The problem is that British people have not been taken on that journey by any politician to the point of accepting that a Norwegian style approach of heavy investment in individuals in the system with focus on their release and all the costs that involves, and much shorter sentences and much smaller use of prison generally, is actually successful in reducing overall rates of crime and therefore the number of victims. If people understood and believed that, as I think people in Norway do, then I think people would vote for it, but they don't understand it and they don't believe it. And hence the Daily Mail, every time there's any sort of case where there's a concern about a level of sentence or someone being released, all of the headlines almost across the board, no matter what the political sort of persuasion of the publication is, this is a judge being soft or the system doesn't work, rather than actually maybe the system needs to look at things differently. So I think pragmatism is the key. They have pragmatism in Switzerland now over drug policy and a number of other countries. They look at what works rather than an emotional response to things being bad. And it's only when you start to, divorce policy from emotion and look at evidence that you can actually change. And Norway is the best example of an evidence-based approach to the use of imprisonment, an evidence-based approach to the whole criminal justice system. And lo and behold, since the 90s, when they had much higher crime rates than they do now, they've seen this big reduction in criminality and a much smaller prison population than they had then.
And of course, one of the ways that this has been done, and particularly in terms of rehabilitation, has been training prisoners. So, David, how best do you think we can make the case for training prisoners and ensuring that they are ready for the world of work, to a public which, as we've touched upon, and both Chris and Lauren have mentioned, maybe perhaps sceptical of this idea, particularly given how the press might react to it?
I think training and employment is key in helping to support people to do that. But before I touch on that, look, and just put a little bit of a defence in for the Labour government in 1997 to 2010. I mean, we increased the number of community sentences dramatically. We tried to encourage that. We tried to make them more visible. We tried to make them part of the community so people could see and understand that the community-based sentence was not a soft option. It was still an option that was helping, with support and rehabilitation. We increased the number of drug treatment orders, alcohol treatment orders, support for people who were, dealing with, particularly women offenders, with the Colston report that we commissioned to try to look at how we can reduce the number of women in prison. There's a lot of effort done. And the Tony Blair slogan of 97 was tough on crime, yes, but also tough on the causes of crime. So we were trying to identify, through Sure Start, through a whole range of other mechanisms, how we prevent young people particularly getting into the criminal justice system in the first place. We put in youth prevention orders. We did a whole range of stuff like that, which was designed to try to be showing that we understand that people don't want crime, but we're also trying to look at some of the long-term root causes. And one of the things, going back to the employment issue, was to try to link employers in the community with prison people in prison. I established with the Timson Company the provision of the Timson workshop in Liverpool Prison, which was the first real opportunity to get people who were guaranteed a job if they completed the time in prison when they left prison to work for Timson's. And now Timson's employs something like 65-70% of people are former offenders. So what I think we need to try to look at doing is, particularly now, for a whole range of reasons, not least of which is Brexit, there's a whole range of skill shortages in our community. There's a whole range of training opportunities. We should be using the prison system to try and encourage and look at what those skill shortages are, match prisoners and prisons with long-term employment shortage needs. We've got a whole range of things, from agriculture through to transport, through to a whole range of things which are there, and look at how we meet those training needs for the future. I also, this is something we tried to press in government, which dropped off the edge in 2010, is to look at how the power of government itself can look at employing people who've come out of the prison system. Local government, central government is one of the biggest employers in the United Kingdom, if not the biggest employer in the United Kingdom, and it doesn't perform in relation to identifying support for people coming through the community, looking at skills and training. That's not just about what we've had in the past, which is people laying bricks or looking at electricity. It's about the whole purpose of how can we link in people to have training and employment opportunities linked to real and meaningful jobs, not to sort of courses that may or may not help them get employment later. And I think the other key thing is we've still got to, and I think hopefully my other colleagues will agree, there are still many people going to prison who have basic difficulties with literacy and numeracy and with basic social skills for a whole range of reasons, parental background, employment opportunities, a whole range of things. We have to try and look at continuing to raise those basic levels of skills whilst people are with us. And it's basically going back to, I think, what colleagues have said earlier, a people-centered approach. I want something that looks at Will and says, Will has shortages in these or these skills. Will has the potential to do something if he leaves us in 2 years' time. What do we do with Will in that 2-year period to help tackle the problems that have brought him into us in the first place, but also prepare him or her for life outside in 1, 2 or 3 years' time? And that's what we should be trying to do. And there's a really good sell there, going back to what Chris has said earlier, about saying to the public, this is the time that we have a custodial responsibility, but also a reforming responsibility for individuals. And in that time, we have to not just incarcerate, but we have to identify, suggest, improve, train and help in order to rehabilitate and reintegrate. And investment in that will ultimately cut crime when those people come out of prison.
Absolutely.
David, sorry to interrupt you. David, can I ask you a question? Because I think this is the nub of the issue, if you like, which you've identified, is that the things that you've described as the Norwegian model has demonstrated cost money. And I just wonder, how do you persuade your constituent, if you're an MP or the public who are listening to political speeches, how do you persuade the public that we should invest, let's say, £100,000 in this person who's in prison, when at a time of rising unemployment and huge cuts across the public sector? Is it possible politically ever to persuade the public to invest in offenders, in inverted commas, when we're so short of money in the public purse?
I think there's always an appetite, Chris, and for me, there's an appetite in the communities that I represented to reduce crime. There's an appetite to make sure that, again, in some of the estates that I represented, there may be 2 or 3 offenders who continually offend, spend 3 to 6 months in prison, come out again, and offending goes up when those people are out. We've got to try to persuade people, and this is one of the things that we were trying to do, with controversial though it was, with visibility of community sentences. We're giving people a visible example of what's been branded as a community-based sentence, to try to show people that investment in the individual, or investment in a non-prison sentence, or investment in employment opportunities was a good thing. But we can also persuade, we can do it silently and not visibly. We can do it via support people like Timpson's. I mean, nobody outside of the criminal justice world walks into Timpson's Euston Station and thinks that person's a criminal or former criminal. But those chances are there's a 7 in 10 chance that they are a former offender. So we can do it by persuading business to take a liberal approach to employment. We can do it by persuading local authorities and housing associations to take a liberal approach to rehousing. We can do it by making the case for reducing crime by investing in people, because the people who are in the system are people who are going to walk around the streets in 3 years' time, in 2 years' time. How do we make them better? That justice reinvestment argument has to be made. People have an appetite for more policing. They should also have an appetite for more investment to reduce the need for more policing in the first place.
Lauren, turning to the question that I had originally put to David, how best do you think we can make that case for training prisoners and ensuring that they are ready for the world of work?
So I think it's really important that we note as well that obviously the majority of prisoners are not on whole life sentences. So when they are released, we basically have to say to the public, look, they're going to be released. So what would you rather? Would you rather they were productive and helped to rejoin society? Because we know a lot of prisoners come from marginalized demographics. So we need to be prepared, as David said, to invest in people, because there are still barriers and there is still stigma against ex-offenders in the world of work that really do need to be addressed. Because if we're saying, the punishment here is the custodial sentence, once you've served the sentence, within reason, obviously, there are some jobs that would not be appropriate for certain offenders. there shouldn't be a barrier to you getting a job. And if we want to start with an evidence-based approach, it helps if we've got the evidence, we've got the case studies, we've got the success stories that have worked, that we can highlight to the public and say, look, this is what's been going on, this is what we've invested in, it's worked, this pilot scheme's worked, for example. Timpson's is a great example I was going to talk about as well, but I'm glad David did. So it's the common sense economic case for it. More people will work as well. It's good for the economy and it's good for productivity. But it's also about seeing how work is a protective factor in rehabilitation, because helping someone into the world of work, as the research shows us, will hopefully make it less likely for them to return to crime. And it's all about breaking the cycle and helping people end the conditions that contributed to their offending behaviour to begin with, whether that's poverty, homelessness. So it's helping people get that training, get those skills, build up their self-esteem, because that's important as well, and bring them back into mainstream society and hopefully help them stay there as well.
Absolutely. I'd like to move now from, we've obviously talked about prisoners within the system, but I'd like now to turn to prison staff. One of the largest differences between Norway and the UK is how we value and train prison staff. Is there a way for the UK to better train and support staff working in prisons? David, what do you think?
I think we've got to look at it the whole. If we talk to the public about prison staff, people will think of the sort of porridge type warder. What we've got to look at really is the whole team. There are people there involved in education, in healthcare, in policing, in inverted commas, the cell regime. And we've got to look at raising the standard of that and supporting those people, making sure they feel valued, making sure they feel well paid, and making sure that they have a proper career structure. And what we've had, and this is a bit political, Will, apologies for this, we've lost 40% of frontline staff in prisons in the last 12 years. That has a real impact on the ability of an individual member of staff to relate to a person who is in their care and responsibility sphere when that person's in prison. If you've got somebody who's working with 25, 30 offenders in prison, as opposed to 5 or 6, that makes a big difference in terms of understanding the quality and understanding the support that they can give. So I've always argued, when I was in Parliament as a minister, but also in opposition, that we have to invest in the staff, because the staff are the people who deliver the services to the people that are in our care, and who we have a responsibility to return to society in a better place than they were when they came to us. So, ensuring that there's continuous training, ensuring that there's continuous support, ensuring that people themselves feel valued, ensuring that they feel well paid, is part of the prison investment that we need. And again, I'm sure Chris will back this up, but one of the easiest targets to make for a government in the current spending round next time round will be to cut the amount of money spent on the Ministry of Justice, because most of the members of the public don't see that interface between the MOJ and their daily lives. They will feel it on health, they will feel it on transport, they will feel it on potentially areas of local government support. They won't necessarily feel it in terms of the Ministry of Justice immediately, although in due course, by goodness me, they will. So chancellors very often go, in 2010, a 40% cut in the Ministry of Justice in year one of the then coalition government made a really big difference that the government now had to roll back on over time, because it felt that it couldn't maintain the buildings, couldn't maintain the staff, couldn't maintain the offending reduction regime, and they've had to recalibrate that. So I think the staff are the people who deliver the service, and you have to invest in them, their training, their support, and make them feel valued, because they are the first person that is the contact with the system that we're trying to improve.
Absolutely. Lauren, on the same question, do you think that there's a way for the UK to better train and support staff working in prisons?
I think for a start, there needs to be the recognition that a prison officer is seen up there as a highly skilled job on par with policing or social work, because quite often a lot of people don't see them on the same level. And when you consider they're responsible for the day-to-day care of the prisoners, they have to do all of these jobs rolled into one. So it's it's a difficult job that I think a lot of people don't give the right amount of credit for. I think, as I wrote in the paper, the difference between our prison staff and in Norway they basically have to do a degree level amount of training where they learn sort of the physical, the theoretical side of the job, but they're trained in sort of a variety of disciplines, like criminology, how to deal with like interpersonal issues, social work, mental health support. If you compare that to British prisons, especially private prisons, which don't get the same level of kind of training, often we're deploying our prison officers into some very complex, distressing situations that they've not actually had the adequate training for. They haven't been given the tools to build the resilience they need to do that job. So it must be really quite stressful for them. And, you know, we are losing so many through cuts, and there's also a high rate of attrition with people dropping out. So, yeah, potentially professionalising the job, you know, giving them the opportunity to do more training, a high level of qualification to ensure that they're better equipped to handle things. I know there are various sort of prison reform charities that want to see, you know, like maybe a conversion course for, let's say, criminology students. They could do a year bolt-on that would qualify them to work in prisons. But it's changing the nature of the job, so it's not just a job you can kind of fall into. It's a vocation. It's a highly valued job. I think there needs to be that distinction from how it is currently, because it's not being valued as it should.
Absolutely. Do we think then, finally, that there is a path to changing both public opinion and party policy towards reforming prisoners, and how would we do that? Chris, what do you think?
I think, well, I mean, it arises from the last point. I mean, the truth of it is, as David pointed out, that justice suffered the largest cuts of all in percentage terms in the austerity round, in the Osborne austerity round back in 2010. And the prison system is massively overcrowded in terms of numbers of prisoners, and massively understaffed in terms of number of staff. And you know, the problem, if you like, is that we're starting from a position where already there's been a huge underinvestment in the system over a very long period of time, just at the time when the government's looking for yet more austerity sort of cuts and more cuts in public expenditure. And one suspects, as I think David was alluding to, that the current Chancellor will find it easier to make those cuts, albeit that the justice budget is tiny compared to the other budgets in the public sector, particularly health and education and so forth. It's a relatively tiny budget, but it's just very easy to salami slice justice and to show that we've saved $1 billion or 2 or 3 as part of the total. And I'm afraid I fear that we are going to see things get worse long before they get better, if they ever get better. You know, the irony of where they've ended up in the US, a country that supposedly hates tax and supposedly is, you know, in favor of sort of individual liberty, they have a population, a prison population of 2.5 million, and it costs trillions of dollars a year of taxpayers' money to service that system. So I'm afraid I don't see in policy terms, I see no evidence at all of anyone doing the one thing that I think that you could do to kind of deal with some of those crucial issues, which are overcrowded prisons and understaffed prisons. And for me, the number one policy initiative would be a reform of our drug laws, because many people in prison, a huge percentage of people are in prison either because of drug problems, in other words, drug addiction and committing drug-related crime, or directly because they've committed a drug crime of some sort, including drug supply. If you take the drugs out of the criminal justice system and put them into a sort of health and welfare system, then you have the opportunity to dramatically reduce the prison population, dramatically reduce the harms that come from the prohibition of drugs in health terms, in organized crime and all the other things. And if we were to, you know, by that mechanism, reduce the prison population by, say, 20 or 30% over a 5-year period, which is, but, you know, by no means unachievable, then you don't need to spend more, because suddenly you've got fewer people to service in the system. So the overcrowding goes and the understaffing becomes less significant. But ultimately, the $1 million question is, are we prepared to invest? We know that it costs, and Lauren will confirm the up-to-date figure, but it costs, I think, over £100,000 a year to keep someone in a Norwegian prison. Our average spend is about 45,000 across the system. That's a big gap, and the reason for that additional spend is the staff ratio in Norwegian prisons is dramatically higher, 2 or 3 times higher than ours. So that ability to interact individually with prisoners, as Lauren described, the professionalism of the staff, which of course means more money on the training and higher salaries. Are we willing to do that? Or these are the political issues and the economic issues we've got to wrestle with as a country. Sadly, as someone who's not a politician, but someone who, works within the criminal justice system and observes and thinks about it carefully, I see no evidence of movement in the right direction. And if you listen to anything that comes out of Cllr Braverman's mouth, and she's the current Home Secretary, sadly, I mean, it's remarkable that she's achieved that position. But the Home Secretary of our country is doing nothing but sound bites advocating more of the same or worse. So I just see no direction of travel, sadly, in policy terms, in the right direction. But reform of drugs and drug law would be the one policy initiative you could take, which would dramatically reduce the criminal justice system, the size and impact of the criminal justice system, and improve lives and reduce harms. And so for me, if you're going to do something, maybe you could persuade the public, you could take them on a journey in that direction. I think it's easier to do that than just say we want to spend 100,000 per year per prisoner, which is what it would take to have a Norwegian model of incarceration.
Mm-hmm. David, do you think that there's a path to changing both public opinion and party policy towards reforming prisoners?
Just sorry, I'm just going to shut the doors because there's people just come in who didn't realise I was doing this. It's all right.
Sure.
The family's come back in the middle of this interview, and they decided to put the stuff in the freezer, which is in the next room. So it's one of those occupational hazards of working from home at the moment. I mean, essentially, I think the one thing you have to try and do is that any government that's elected in 1 or 2 years' time will have crime and reduction of crime at the heart of its manifesto. And from my perspective, as a Labour member of the Labour Party, I would want a Labour government to be looking not just at how we police and provide support for policing in our society, but how we actually have a long-term plan to reduce crime. And one of the things that we're looking at is certainly the potential to look at the sort of issues that Chris has done in relation to a Royal Commission to get some discussion around that, which is fine. But I think we can certainly do some things in the very short term, which is, for example, look at the people who are in prison for under 12 months. How do we find alternative-based sentences for those people who are going to prison for under 12 months? How do we begin to increase again drug and alcohol treatment orders? How do we support people in the community on community-based penalties to get people out of prison? We can reduce that, and we can make better, in my view, use of the resource that's going into people on short-term prison sentences by transferring that with a political will into short-term community-based sentences or short-term treatment orders and treatment sentences, which will help, in my view, turn round our society. In the people who are going through prison and the 60% reoffending rate we've got for people sentenced to under 12 months. A major push also on the areas we've touched about earlier, which I think can be done with political will, which the public may not even notice, on employment, on health investment into prisons. That is a real chance to actually turn around people's lives and to make the through the gate experience a much more positive thing. Now, it does take money, it does take effort, but ultimately that's in a sense, that's an internal government argument. That's an argument that ministers can make to the Treasury with the support of number 10, which we've had to do as ministers in the past, to put investment into certain areas. But the public question is, how do we reduce crime? And are we a government that's committed to reducing crime? Internally, that's where that argument lies. And the points that Chris has made is about a minister like me in the Ministry of Justice, with the support of the Secretary of State, bringing people around the table who are responsible in government for health, for education, for employment, and making a collective case together to the Treasury and to number 10 to put resources into this area, because ultimately it will achieve our ultimate aim, which is to reduce crime and make people feel safer. And as any government, going back to the points that we've really skirted around, any government has to say, we're going to try and reduce crime. And any government is judged on how it reduces crime and whether it has reduced crime. But I think the internal arguments are sometimes the things that we can do in government and take the case to the public, as opposed to get permission from the public, first of all, to do those things.
Absolutely. We've now come to the Q&A section of this event. So as Torin has put in the chat, if anybody wants to ask a question, then you can either pop it in the chat, or if you want to ask the question in person rather than me reading it out, just raise your hand and Torin will unmute you and you'll be able to ask your question. So is there anyone who would like to go first? I think, Torin, you do actually have a question that you wanted to ask, didn't you? So why don't you kick get the ball rolling?
Yeah, no, I mean, my question was mainly around sort of the Norwegian and I suppose more generally the Nordic welfare systems. I mean, you know, a lot of the conversation around prisons ends up focusing on, of course, the experience of someone in prison, you know, training them for work afterwards, but sort of rarely, in some ways, what David said about that, preventing people from going to prison in the first place, and also making sure that there's those sort of safety nets. So, you know, how much is that a factor? Because, you know, the UK, for instance, it could go and it could almost replicate the Norwegian prison system without replicating the rest of that that sort of system of welfare and everything else. So how much of a difference do you think that specific element of welfare support and everything else does that system actually make?
Who would like to answer first?
I'd argue, Torin and Will, that you know, things, for example, and this is again a bit of a political, things like Sure Start, things like investment in early years education, things like identifying, you know, individuals who potentially have challenges in their early years, and putting some investment in to turn those individuals around at that stage is equally as important as what we do with people if they're 12, 13, 14, 16, 17, 18 into the prison system and justice system. So, you know, there is a real need for community investment in employment, housing, social projects, and life opportunities, which will help, I think, you know, reduce the potential for criminal behaviour at a later stage in life. And that should go hand in hand. And the Norwegians have invested for many years in that. They are, again, I would argue that the Labour government between 97 and certainly 2005-06 tried to do that through a whole range of social measures, which, you know, had moderate success, I think. But we need to put those two things hand in hand. It's not just about the consequences of criminal offending behaviour and what we do with people when they come into the system. It's about preventing people going into the system in the first place. And there's a number of mechanisms that a good social welfare society should be able to undertake to prevent people going into the system as far as we can. You know, not being naive about it, but we can still do that, and we can still make a difference in you know, a percentage of individuals.
Absolutely. I mean, Chris, would you like to comment on this question at
Yeah,
all?
I mean, I think as anyone who's read my book knows, I advocate a much more sort of radical approach to that, which is that we should take all children out of the criminal justice system completely, as they've done in a number of countries. And the reason for that, I think, is obvious on two fronts, I would hope. One is, when you criminalise a child as young as 10, and admittedly it's uncommon to have 10-year-olds prosecuted, but it does happen, but certainly much more common to see 12, 13 and 14-year-olds taken to the youth court, some of them even given custodial terms of one kind or another. When you do that, you create a criminal for life. And so you create this, you know, if you criminalise a 13 or 14, I mean, I did youth court work as a young criminal defence lawyer, and, you know, once people have, they don't see the criminal justice system as something to be afraid of. It just becomes their life. And so, you know, and obviously it's exactly the same as if you treat a 12 or 13-year-old, you know, in any walk of life. If you educate them well, then the chances are you'll give them a good chance in life. If you look after their health and their mental health, the chances are those things will survive into later life. But if you treat them and you actually label them as a criminal, you give them a criminal record, which doesn't even get expunged, as they would call it in America, at the age of 18. In this country, it still remains forever on their criminal record, never goes away from you know. And just if you think about that, if that's another area of policy, again, anyone who's read the book will know that, you know, I'm in favour of very radical approaches, because when you accept the status quo but look to tinker around the edges, the problem is, there was huge good intention, as David rightly says, and nothing I've said about the Labour government should be taken as a criticism of the intention. The problem is the outcomes. The outcome was we had a much higher prison population in 2010 than we did in 1997, and we had we didn't significantly reform our criminal justice system during that whole 13-year period. And for me, that was a lost opportunity because we had a government that was, broadly speaking, sympathetic to reform, but sadly, the outcomes, at the end of it all, were not favourable. We didn't see a reduction in prison sentences, and we didn't see the sorts of reforms that I'm talking about. And we did see lots of children, still thousands a year, going through the criminal justice system. Some of these sort of really fundamental kind of radical reforms like that, I think, are the only way you turn the system at a time of pressure on resource. Because that's we can't ignore the fact that they're to coin the phrase, I think, of a former chancellor or chief secretary of the Treasury, there's no money left. We've spent it all. So if we're going to look for reforms, I think we need to look for reforms that are either cost neutral or actually save money. And I've got no doubt, if you make the argument, one thing I disagree with David about, I don't think criminal justice policy has ever been stage centre of anyone's manifesto. The truth of it is, it's the economy, it's health and education. It's those three things that actually are fundamentally driving political debate and political policy, particularly at times of crisis as we have at the moment. And that's why criminal justice has never really gets the attention it needs, except when right-wing politicians argue for ever higher sentences, which is what Priti Patel and Boris Johnson did in 2019.
I think tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime was quite a fairly straightforward manifesto commitment in '97. Yeah,
but if you analyse it, David, the problem is, what does tough on crime mean? It means more you keep sending people to prison for more time.
It was trying to state it. I think it was trying to say, and this is going back to the argument, how do you win the argument? Tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime was trying to say, look, we understand that crime is a problem in your community. We understand that. And we're not going to just avoid that, but we're going to try and tackle some of the causes of crime and help to try to change people's behaviour. And that's, again, there's many criticisms, but I think we tried to do that. We did try to do that.
The social policy, no disagreement, but the very fact that you have to use the phrase tough on crime, what is that? As I say, for me, the only thing it could possibly mean is we're going to be tough on criminals, we're going to give more sentences, we're going to crack down, and that's just the same as the
it gives, no, Chris says, well, I said, well, I disagree, and I apologise for this, but tough on crime gives you the opportunity to be dealing with the issues of rehabilitation, to deal with reinvestment in those issues. I think it does, because it says to people, we understand that crime is a problem in your community and we're going to try and tackle it. So we're going to try and tackle it by tackling the causes of crime as well. And that's, I think, tries to get that permission through. And that's what we tried to do on a range of issues, and some success. And we did also modernise the prison system. We decommissioned 10 or 11 prisons, and we've tried to put some, because a broken window prison is not a good place to be. We have to put investment into the estate as well as into the people.
As worthwhile as a discussion of the 1997 manifesto is, we do have a couple of other extra questions that I'd like to get your responses to. Joseph asked, outside of Centre, what organisations / charities are campaigning effectively for a Norwegian-style prison reforms? Lauren, do you know of any other organisations that are doing this?
So whether or not I think they explicitly say it as like, we are copying the Norway model, we want to copy the Norway model, there's lots of other charities and organisations that look at it from an evidence and a harm reduction based approach. So I think good starting points would be like the Prison Reform Trust, Howard League for Penal Reform. Those are the two that I kind of looked at when I was doing a lot of the research. I'm sure there are lots more that are using like the explicit Norwegian model as a kind of starting point, but those are the two that I would say I looked at most for inspiration, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, they're admirable organisations that have been around a very long time. The Prison Reform Trust and the Howard League, and the difficulty is, and there's no criticism of those organisations, is that what they're largely trying to do is to advocate reform of the current system, rather than, as it were, ripping up the system and saying, actually, we're doing everything wrong. The whole system is just driving more crime. That it's almost like an industry, and you couldn't create a better industry for increasing levels of crime than our current current criminal justice and prison system. So tinkering at the edges and saying, let's improve this, let's improve that. I mean, the point that Torrin made about, well, you know, if we moved over to the Norwegian model, we couldn't, because our prison population is simply so stratospherically large in comparison to the Norwegian prison system, that the cost of imprisoning everyone in the Norwegian conditions, it would cost tens of billions, and no one's ever going to find that money right now. So the only way through it is to cut the numbers in the system. Then you can start to invest, and you start to see a little bit of opportunity. And also, if you cut the numbers in the system in the way that I advocate, with reform of children's justice and drug crime in particular, and getting away from this idea of just punishment for its own sake. If you do those reforms, what will happen is what's happened in other countries, Norway being one example. What's also, I mentioned Switzerland in drug policy, is when the public see that the reforms that they weren't sure about, like the liberalisation of drugs, like in Switzerland, they give free heroin to heroin users. You know, now I try to advocate that. Good luck to David trying to stand on a platform saying we're going to give heroin free to every heroin user. But they do that in Switzerland as a matter of basic human rights. Their human rights have recognised addiction as a disability in the same way as any other disability, whereas our Equality Act specifically excludes addiction from the rights of disability. And we have the exact opposite approach. In the Swiss Supreme Court, they decided that addiction is a disability, and those who are addicted are entitled to a full range of medical support and help, including access to pharmaceutical heroin twice a day. Now what's happened is massive reduction in drug-related or heroin-related crime, and the public have gone, this is great, we love it, let's have more and more of this, but only because they've seen it work. So you have to do something, make it work, and then, I mean, this is the point I think that David was making, was, you know, if a government internally and politically can have policies which are demonstrably successful, then you take it to the public and you say, we want you to back us, and here's how it works. But I just don't, you know, the problem is direction of travel is all the other way with our current government, all completely the opposite direction.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We have another question here from Rebecca, which is quite interesting in relation to, as you mentioned, Chris, the size of the prison population in the UK. Rebecca asks, how do we educate the public and government to realise that prison doesn't work? Not only do we have the highest prison population in Western Europe in this country, but the highest levels of prisoner mortality. And this has a massive ripple effect on staff, bereaved families and society. Who would like to go first on that?
Again, I would argue for Rebecca that we should be trying to reduce the number of people who go to prison under 12 months, certainly, and that should be a policy objective of a future government. And to do that, we need to invest in alternatives to that criminal justice approach with prison, and that's a theme that I've tried to put forward here today. And there'd be a great number of third-party organisations in the criminal justice system would also argue for that as well. And we can do that by showing that, again, people sometimes don't understand. I remember when I was prisons minister, I went into a prison once, and somebody was there, and I said, "Well, what's happening when you go out?" He said, "I don't know. My life's in the skip." Because for 12 weeks in the prison, they've lost the flat that they had. All their belongings have gone. There's no family connection. If anybody has an employment, they've lost that employment. They're potentially going back to the same cohort of people they were with before, but with less economic value and less challenge. We have to find a way to reduce and end the short-term prison sentence. And to do that takes a political will. We tried that in 2.8, 2.9, 2.10. We've got to try it again, and we've got to keep really focused on a 5-year parliament, whatever else we do with Chris's points, to say that there is no scope or the benefit to society by having short-term prison sentences where people go through a revolving door without time to have alcohol, drug, other mental health challenge treatments, and to put people in for 12, 15 weeks to find that at the end of the day, their life is just gone when they come out. So that can be a really important political objective, to reduce the number of people in prison and to reduce the way in which prison approaches the under 12-month sentence.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. We do have one more question, but I know that you have to go on the hour, David. So if you need to go now, that's perfectly fine if you want to, because there is just the one more question to ask. So, but thank you very much for being
Good
here,
to meet you,
and
David.
joining us.
I'll stay for the question. No problems. You're all right.
Oh, okay, okay, all right.
We're okay.
So
I'm on a 3:15 elsewhere, Will. So we've got 15-minute overlap.
all right, okay. I've been given a slightly different endpoint, but never mind. So Luke has our final question, which is, why is the UK so adamantly against drug reform? It seems that many Western countries, parts of the US and European countries, are moving away from entirely prohibition models, but the UK is entrenched in its views. Even welfare interventions that have been around since the 1990s in Norway, such as public safer injection rooms, seem impossible to be actioned in the UK. Now, Chris, I'm sure you'd like to come in first on this if you.
Well, I think there's the answer is, once again, it's about public perception and it's about the messaging that comes from politicians, more generally, the sort of accepted wisdom, if you like, in society, which is that drugs are morally wrong in some way, and that anyone who, and of course, it's very interesting. So I made a speech recently, and someone who was actually a criminal barrister and prosecutor stood up and in all seriousness said to me, drugs are morally wrong, but not this Bordeaux that I'm enjoying, and not this big fat cigar that I'm smoking. That's perfectly reasonable, because I've got that, I'm under control with those things, and I'm not harming anyone by doing that. And that, in a nutshell, I think summarizes the problem. That the idea that because one set of chemicals was prescribed in 1971, that it takes on some sort of moral kind of quality or immoral quality, whereas other substances, which are equally, and indeed in many cases more dangerous, such as alcohol and nicotine, are legal. That creates a moral distinction between the two. I think the truth of it is that we have, since the early 70s, when the Misuse of Drugs Act came in, we've kind of just accepted as a society that well, ironically, given the high levels of drug use, but at least in public, most people would describe drugs as being wrong in some way and something that needs to be deterred. And you know, reality is you can't stop people taking drugs. No one's ever been able to stop people taking drugs since time began, literally since time began. So the answer is, in terms of drug policy, I don't know. I mean, if we are dipping our little toe in the water of heroin-assisted treatment, and in Middlesbrough and in Glasgow, there are very, very small programs which mirror the programs that exist across Switzerland, which are essentially that twice a day, heroin users go to a clinic, they're given pharmaceutical grade heroin once in the morning, once in the afternoon or early evening, and for the rest of the day, they go to work or they go to college, and you know, what they don't do is burgle houses or sell their bodies because they need to raise £200 a day to buy heroin. And the interesting factor, I think, behind that policy is that it came in not because some charismatic politician said, I've got this great idea, let's give away free heroin. It came in because there were needles and active open heroin use in public in Switzerland, in Geneva and Zurich and other cities. And the public said, we want this problem off the streets. So the local government and local politicians took it off the streets into heroin-assisted treatment programs and into what are called consumption rooms, or shooting galleries, some call them, into consumption rooms, so that suddenly the public saw the benefit of a more pragmatic, health-based approach to heroin use in particular. And now you won't see a railway station full of heroin addicts lying on the floor. You won't see needles in public parks where children play. And you know, there are many parts of the UK where, sadly, you know, drug use does lead to very significant disruption in communities, and even harms, obviously criminal harms, robberies and burglaries and so on. I think if you could reduce all of those things by a pragmatic approach, we just need to invest in it, you know, and the investment in the short term, you see huge returns. When you open a heroin-assisted treatment program, the cost of it is not actually that high, because heroin is very cheap to buy when the government buys it as pharmaceutical heroin. But you just suddenly see a huge decline in property crime and other forms of crime, and around in communities that are heavily afflicted by heroin issues. And you know, lo and behold, you do something that actually works, and the people will support it, as they have done in Switzerland. The more you invest in these programs, the more you demonstrate that they work, the more likely the public will get behind them, and then you really see the benefits that come from a pragmatic approach to drug policy.
Lauren, would you like to come in on this?
Yeah, just quickly, obviously, I'm a Labour member, so I've done a lot of work, or sort of looked at the recommendations made by the Labour campaign for drug policy reform, and they've got some really good stuff. But, countries like Portugal, they've gone even further than just your basic sort of diversion schemes, because you might remember Sadiq Khan suggested a cannabis diversion scheme in London, and the media and even some of the Labour Party absolutely just slated him because they thought he was trying to decriminalise things. So there's a real misunderstanding between actually the difference between legalization, diversion, decriminalization. So it's actually educating the public to understand the differences. And then you've got countries like Portugal that have gone even further. They've legalized drugs. And as Chris was saying, when you do these kinds of schemes, you end up sort of driving down crime rates. You can drive down HIV rates. You can improve general health just by having like a public health approach to the way you deal with drugs. And actually, in some cases, it's actually reduced the usage of some drugs as well. So rather than taking a prohibitionist approach, you've actually done what you've set out to do by making drugs like not easier to come by, but, not slapping massive sentences on having drugs. So there's a lot to think about, but politicians really need to start thinking outside the box, I think, because lives are literally depending on it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think we will end it there. We've gone a little bit over time. I'd like to thank all our panelists, David, Chris and Lauren. If people want to find out more about you, could you just quickly say where they can find you online, follow you on Twitter, your website, that kind of thing? David, where can people find you?
I'm at Twitter at the right on Dave Hanson. There you go. I lost my blue tick a while back when I lost my seat, so I've got a new Twitter handle now. RTHON Dave Hanson.
Fantastic. Chris?
So I'm at Criminology UK on Twitter. I also have a YouTube channel, Chris Daw KC, as it's now called, which has actually lots of stuff for law students and people who are interested in legal careers, as well as some of the policy stuff. And of course, they can read my book, Justice on Trial, which is just behind me.
And finally, Lauren.
Twitter is probably easiest. So my @ is @LaurenD2212.
Fantastic. Thank you once again for everybody who has come and watched the event, and thanks again to all our panelists. I hope you will enjoy the next event, whatever it is, which would hopefully be available to sign up for soon. So thanks once again, everyone.
Thanks. Well, good work. Good presentation.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Cheers.
Take care.